Undercover boss orders breakfast. At bakery cafe stops cold. When waitress says tips leave staff hungry morning, sunlight streamed through the large glass window of Morning Glow Cafe, casting a golden hue on each wooden chair, each sugar-dusted pastry shelf. Michael Foster, 50 years old, CEO and founder of Morning Glow Cafe, sat quietly in a familiar corner of the cafe. His eyes, once bright with faith and hope, now glistened with a trace of fatigue and contemplation. A small but cozy cafe, once his cherished dream, now held countless unanswered questions. Every tile on the floor beneath his feet, each one he had personally overseen and laid, hoping to transform Morning Glow Cafe into the second home for all employees. A place where each morning the gentle music blended with the scent of freshly baked pastries, welcoming guests seeking a moment of peace in the hustle and bustle of the city. Michael had always believed that a cafe didn't just sell coffee but also sold hope, humanity, and faith in fairness. But recently, Morning Glow Cafe was no longer the second home he had once envisioned. Rumors of unfair tip distribution spread like wildfire. Some longtime employees quietly resigned, leaving behind resignation letters tinged with regret. The eyes of those who stayed behind had also changed, tired, skeptical, and heavier than ever. Revenue began to decline, and customer complaints about service attitude increased. Like tiny cracks on a wall once built with love and trust, each crack spread further, threatening to shatter the very foundation of faith Michael had worked so hard to build. Michael had heard countless stories from the managers, seen the polished reports sent via email, and on paper, everything still seemed fine. But he knew that numbers could hide the corners that only truly caring eyes could see. He understood that a CEO could only truly know his cafe when he sat down at the familiar wooden tables, listening to the cafe's heartbeat and watching the eyes of the people who had dedicated themselves to the place. That's why this morning he decided to close the reports, remove his usual suit, and put on simple clothes to disguise himself as an ordinary customer. He stepped into Morning Glow Cafe, his cafe, with a heavy heart. His steps were quiet, but his eyes burned with determination. Determination to uncover the truth about the place he had once entrusted his whole heart. His hand brushed lightly over the pastry counter, where the slices of toast still emitted a buttery aroma, where employees' eyes had once shone with hope every morning. A rush of memories came back the first day of opening, the day everyone laughed together because tips were shared fairly, the day every drop of sweat was repaid with gratitude and genuine smiles. Now those memories remained only like a shadow hidden beneath the golden light streaming from the ceiling. Michael sighed and looked around the cafe. The scene was still familiar, but he knew that behind those polite smiles could be hearts breaking. And he, Michael Foster, founder of Morning Glow Cafe, understood that if he didn't find the truth with his own hands, everything he had built would collapse, and the trust of those who had once called this place a second home would never be restored. And so this morning, the 50-year-old CEO, chose to sit quietly in a corner of his cafe like a stranger. His eyes not only observed, but absorbed every detail. Jessica's forced smile as she greeted customers, the sly glance of the young staff member at the POS machine, the triumphant laughter of the group of employees who were favored with high tips. Each detail was a piece of the puzzle he needed to complete the picture. Michael knew that when the sun rose high, its golden light would illuminate every dark corner, and he, the founder, would not let injustice linger over the roof he once called Sunrise Cafe, because he understood that only when justice was restored would this place truly be a second home for everyone, as he had promised on that very first day. Michael sat silently in a corner of the cafe, his hand still resting on the coffee cup that had long gone cold. The golden light from the ceiling shone down, highlighting the beads of sweat still lingering on his forehead. In Michael's eyes, the once warm, home-like Morning Glow Cafe now took on a different look, cold, distant, like the very faith that was slowly leaving him. He quietly observed Emily, a young woman with slightly tousled hair, dark circles under her eyes from long, exhausting shifts. She continued to diligently wipe tables, arrange pastries, and offer a forced smile to guests. Michael noticed she was always assigned to shifts during off-peak hours, when customers were sparse and tips were pitifully low. In his eyes, the yellow light seemed to reveal every line of fatigue, every worry etched deep in the corners of Emily's eyes. He remembered the early days when he himself had fairly distributed every single tip, small amounts that nonetheless ignited hope in the eyes of young people like Emily. In that quiet space, Emily approached his table. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down a plate of freshly toasted bread. Her eyes lowered to the tiled floor, her voice quivering as though confessing a bitter truth. The tips here aren't enough for me to have a decent meal every day. Michael was frozen. Every word she spoke felt like a knife slicing through his heart, the heart of a founder who had once promised himself that no one here would ever be left in need. The image of those days distributing tips fairly flooded back into his mind, like smudged ink on an old page, blurred distant. He wondered to himself, had I forgotten those values? Before Michael could utter a word of comfort, a cleaning staff member passed by. His eyes were as still as a lake, his voice fell cold as the night frost cutting deep into the heavy air. Here the ones who work the hardest are also the ones who suffer the most. Those words were short but enough to render the entire cafe silent. Michael felt his heart pound heavily, each beat like a boulder weighing down his chest. In that moment, he realized that his Sunrise Cafe had lost its most precious value, the spirit of fairness he had once built. The tip-sharing system he had once carefully designed had now been twisted, turned into a tool for greed. Every drop of sweat, every tear, every single tip had now become the spoils of those who knew how to flatter and bend the rules. Michael closed his eyes, and a bead of sweat rolled down his temple. A cold breeze swept in through a gap in the door, causing the worn brown curtain to flutter. In that moment, he knew that no polished report on his desk would save the trust that had been shattered here. If Sunrise Cafe had ever been a second home to its staff, now it had become a battlefield of injustice, where the strong seized the most and the weak were left with only tears. Michael opened his eyes, the golden light still dancing on the wooden table, illuminating his tightly clenched hands. Michael knew he could no longer turn away. He, the founder, had to stand up and fight for justice, not just for Emily, but for everyone who had once called this place their second home. Because more than anyone he understood, if he didn't speak up today, tomorrow, there would be more Emilys shedding tears over stolen tips. In Michael's heart, a flicker of hope ignited the belief that even one small change could save an entire system. And he was ready. Michael sat silently in the corner of the cafe, his hand loosely gripping a now cold coffee cup, his eyes following every step of the staff. The warm golden light of Morning Glow Cafe poured down, highlighting the tired lines on his face, revealing the contemplative look of a founder watching his dream being eroded by injustice. A slow-burning pain, like a wound that had yet to heal, cut into his every breath. He noticed a group of young staff members, their uniforms crisped their faces, bright people whose eyes gleamed with a triumphant, almost arrogant glow. They walked confidently through the cafe, their posture exuding an air of entitlement as though every reward was already in their hands. Each step they took, every glance they exchanged, seemed to silently declare a special privilege, favoritism that even Michael found hard to name. He saw they were always assigned the busiest shifts when tips were highest, and every step they took across the wooden floor felt like a dagger carving into his belief that this cafe could be fair. Michael's eyes fell on Emily, the young woman who once stood behind the toast counter, her eyes shining when she received her first tip directly from him. Now she stood there, her pale face illuminated by the yellow light, her hands trembling as she wiped the trays. Every gesture of hers was tinged with sadness, as though her worries had seeped into her very breath. Michael noticed that she and those like her were always assigned to the slowest shifts, where tips were so meager they barely covered a meal. Emily's eyes looked lost, as if searching for refuge in a sea of injustice. Michael turned his gaze to the POS counter, where the cold blue light from the computer screen illuminated the cold, expressionless face of a young employee. He stood there, his hands moving swiftly across the keyboard, his fingers dancing with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. Each click of his felt like a blade slicing through the sweat and tears of people like Emily. Michael could see the tip amounts appear and then vanish from the screen, tips that rightfully belonged to the hard-working young staff, now shamelessly stolen without explanation. A sharp pain rose in Michael's chest, as if his heart was being squeezed by the very system he had once trusted. Memories of the old days flooded back when he personally divided each tip fairly, when the staff's eyes sparkled with trust and gratitude. He remembered those eyes that believed that as long as they worked hard, every drop of sweat would be rewarded. But now Emily's eyes had changed, etched with fear and helplessness. Michael knew she had been quietly recording the injustices she had witnessed. Those small sheets of paper, the trembling handwriting, like a silent scream from someone too afraid to speak up. He pictured her small hand trembling as she picked up the pen, her eyes darting around the cafe like a thief stealing light, afraid of being caught. How many tears had fallen on those pages, soaking into the corrected numbers? The unspoken pain. Michael took a deep breath, his hand gripping the coffee cup tightly. Each of his breaths seemed to merge with the breaths of the young people who had once trusted this place as their second home. He could hear his heartbeat, each beat like an unspoken vow. Did I let this happen? In the morning's golden light, every wrinkle at the corners of Michael's eyes became clear, etched by time sacrifice, and countless sleepless nights chasing the problem. He dreamed of building a fair sunrise cafe. Michael knew this wasn't just a fight against a group of cheaters. It was a battle to reclaim the trust that had once been given to him wholeheartedly. He could not allow another Emily to quietly shed tears over tips twisted into privileges for others. Michael's gaze returned to Emily, who stood with her head bowed over the toast tray. In that look, he saw the faces of everyone who had once trusted him, who had once called this place their second home, and he knew he would not let them down. Because with just one small change, with one righteous decision, the flame of trust could be rekindled, reviving the Sunrise Cafe he had once built with all his heart. Michael leaned back in his chair, still gripping the now cold coffee cup, his eyes gazing thoughtfully through the window where people hurried by each with their own small dreams. The morning light shone through the window, reflecting his image, a founder who had once placed absolute faith in his dream, now watching himself become a witness to a Sunrise Cafe, betrayed and twisted by those he had once trusted with responsibility. A burst of laughter from the nearby table startled him. A group of young staff, crisp uniforms, still casually shared jokes, their eyes glinting with smugness, the eyes of those enjoying high tips without having to shed any sweat. Michael felt as though a blade had sliced through his heart. These were the kids he had once mentored, once seen as his pride. Yet now those very eyes made him feel an alienating numbness. In the corner of the bakery, Emily continued to diligently clean the trays, her eyes still glancing toward the POS, as if in a silent plea. Michael knew she was yearning for something to change, a glimpse of fairness, a tear dried by the very trust he had once planted in the hearts of young people like her. Unbidden, Michael imagined her trembling as she held up the piece of evidence, her uneven handwriting, a wordless letter to him, to the CEO she still believed in. Each beep of the POS felt like a cold dagger, repeated like a judgment on all who had worked tirelessly here. Michael watched the pale blue light reflecting off the face of the young employee who was editing tips. The boy's eyes glistened with smugness and disdain, as if he wielded an invisible power to twist other sweat into his own money. Michael could see the boy's deft hand movements, the flickering blue light whispering a horrifying truth. Sunrise Cafe had become a place where trust was sold cheaply. A bead of sweat rolled down Michael's forehead, merging with his rapid breaths, reminding him of the morning he first opened the cafe. Back then he had told himself, this will be a place where people find trust. And yet now that trust was being sold carelessly with every click of a mouse, every cold beep of the POS. His heart ached as he thought about the sleepless nights, the sunlit mornings, the cups of coffee he had shared with each person, all now felt like a dream twisted out of shape. Michael closed his eyes, listening to the whispers of the cafe, the whispers of his own heart. A gentle jazz tune played somewhere, pouring into him, like an old promise reminding him of the look in Emily's eyes, that one bright morning. Those eyes now carried the stain of tears, the look of disappointment, yet still held a glimmer of hope. Hope in him and a CEO she once believed would stand for fairness. Michael opened his eyes, the cafe's golden light shining directly into his eyes, highlighting the worry lines of a founder who had weathered many storms to keep Sunrise Cafe standing tall. He knew that look reflected not only the years gone by, but also an unspoken vow. He would not let this place become the graveyard of the hopes of those who had put their trust in him. He turned his head toward Emily, his gaze like a burning torch of unwavering faith. In the golden light, Emily seemed like a small candle flickering in the dark night. Michael took a deep breath, tightened his grip around the coffee cup, and his voice resounded in his heart, hoarse but resolute, like steel forged in fire. It's time to bring back justice. In the quiet morning light, Michael felt more than ever that this was not just a battle against stolen tips, but a fight to preserve the dream, to reclaim the trust of the people who had helped him build Morning Glow Cafe. He knew he couldn't let another Emily hide her tears behind fear, and he swore to himself that he would do everything to keep that flame of justice from ever dying out. Michael stood up, the old wooden chair creaking like a warning echoing throughout the cafe. The golden light from the ceiling shone on his face, the face of a founder who had once personally divided every tip among his staff, who had smiled and felt proud of having turned this place into a second home for so many. Today, those eyes, once bright with hope, now shone with the resolute, unyielding look of a father standing up to protect his spiritual children. He took a deep breath, his voice resounding deep but powerful, each word like a blade cutting through the veil of lies that had covered Morning Glow. Cafe for too long. I am Michael Foster, the founder of this cafe chain. The room seemed to freeze. Every eye turned toward him, eyes that had once lit up with hope, that had once believed this place was their second home, now glistened with tears of surprise and emotion. The golden light illuminated the stack of papers he raised, high pages marked with undeniable evidence, stolen tips, unfair shift assignments, threatening messages to staff. Every figure, every line like a dagger, carved deep into the trust Michael had so painstakingly built. His voice dropped, but remained as resolute as steel, his eyes sweeping over every manager and employee. This is your sweat and tears stolen by these managers. From today on, every tip will go to those who deserve it. The POS machine beeped, its once familiar sound now rang out like the toll of justice, echoing through the cafe. The manager bowed his head, trembling, the blue light from the POS screen casting across his face, revealing sweat dripping down his temples, sweat of a man whose lies had just been exposed. His eyes showed fear, shame, as though the darkness had been laid bare by the light of justice. Michael turned his gaze toward Emily. That young girl who had once stood by the toast counter with eyes shining with trust, now stood upright, her eyes glistening with tears. But these were no longer tears of fear and resignation. They were tears of a faith just called by its rightful name, justice. The golden light shone on her face, turning her into a beacon of hope for everyone who had ever waited so long for this day. In that moment, Michael knew that golden light didn't just illuminate the room. It lit up the entire Sunrise Cafe, the dream he had once built, where fairness was now finally being named. He saw in the eyes of everyone else the same flame he had once lit, the flame of trust, of hope, of a second home. And he knew Sunrise Cafe had been saved not just with words, but with his heart and with the sweat of all the people who had ever believed this was home. Michael lowered the stack of papers in his hand, his eyes still burning with the same fire that had just been rekindled after so many days of silent decay. A sudden breeze drifted in through the cafe door, rustling his hair strands of silver, dancing like witnesses to the years gone by. He looked around the cafe, every old wooden chair, every toast counter, stained with the sweat of young workers. In that instant, every sound seemed to fade, leaving only the ragged breathing of hearts waiting for an answer. He turned his gaze toward the manager, his voice deep, measured, but firm. Do you know how much a single tip is worth? It's sweat, it's trust, it's a promise between people. You've forgotten that. A sigh escaped from a corner of the cafe, where an older employee, someone who had been with Morning Glow Cafe since the very beginning, bowed their head, eyes red. Beside them, Emily stood, her eyes reflecting something new. A blend of pain and a flicker of hope reborn. A tear slipped from her eye onto the tiled floor, as if carrying the tears of every employee ever buried under those manipulated numbers on the POS screen. Michael continued, his voice ringing out in the air, thick with tension. This POS system wasn't just abused to steal tips. It became a weapon to kill trust. I once believed fairness only needed a transparent system, but I was wrong. True fairness lives in the way we treat the people who made this place a home. A young employee standing near the toast counter, his eyes red, his voice trembling. Sir, if we change, can everything go back to how it was? Michael turned to the young man, his eyes softening, a gentle smile appearing at the corners of his lips, which bore the marks of time. If each of us stands up and defends fairness, then there's no reason this place can't return to the way it used to be, or even better. A round of applause arose from the corner of the cafe, not loud, but enough to make everyone turn and look. It was the applause of a senior employee, and gradually the applause spread throughout the cafe, echoing like a bell, signaling the start of a new change. Michael took a deep breath, his eyes glowing, the eyes of a man who had been through enough ups and downs to understand that fairness doesn't live in numbers, but in the hearts of people who are willing to stand up for one another. He looked straight at the POS screen, the cold blue light that had once made him feel fear and anger, and said, "From today, I will change the tip-sharing policy. Every tip will be distributed transparently and fairly. Every employee will know exactly what they receive. No one will be left behind. No one will have to worry about their next meal because of tips being skimmed off." The cafe seemed to light up. In the bright golden light, Michael saw the eyes of those who had once called this place their second home, eyes filled with rekindled hope. Emily stood there, her eyes shining like a small star in a sky that had once been darkened by deceit. Michael knew this wasn't just a moment of confrontation. It was a moment of rebirth. A new Sunrise Cafe was being rebuilt, starting with a promise kept, a spark of trust rekindled from the very heart of its founder. And he knew fairness had returned not just in words but in actions, in the tears that had fallen onto the tiled floor from Emily, from those who had called this place their second home, and from himself, the one who had once poured his whole heart into building it. The golden light of late morning streamed through the window, falling on Emily's radiant face as she stood behind the toast counter where she had once stood silently, her hands trembling as she wiped away silent tears. Now she wore the uniform of a shift manager, a bright smile on her face, her eyes gleaming with confidence and strength. She had become a symbol of hope and fairness, a representation of those who had once been buried in the darkness, now stepping into the light. Michael stood still, watching her, his hands relaxed, his heart beating slowly, as if a heavy burden had just been lifted. Before him, the young employees chattered eagerly with Emily, their eyes shining with hope, no longer weary, no longer hesitant. He saw that they had been given strength, a new environment, where fairness was no longer an empty slogan, but the very breath of every person. He exhaled a long, steady breath, his voice echoing like a memory of the days when he himself had divided every tip with all his heart. All it takes is a small change, a single click on the POS, a small sign explaining the meaning of tips. To customers, a short, transparent meeting on tip sharing, and that's enough to change an entire system. He remembered those early mornings when he personally divided the tips, the eyes of the young staff back then, eyes bright with trust. Now those eyes reappeared in the eyes of Emily and the other staff. He knew just one right decision, one small change could rekindle the extinguished trust, rebuild an entire second home. Michael looked around the cafe. Everything was still the same. The faint scent of toast, the warm yellow light, but in every breath of the cafe, he could hear a new Sunrise Cafe being reborn, a place where fairness had been restored, where tips were no longer stolen by those lurking in the shadows. A tear fell on Michael's cold coffee cup, a tear from a founder who had once poured his heart into building this place. He smiled faintly, his eyes gleaming with pride. A single tear has changed an entire system. How many more waitresses live on tips they never get? Those words appeared on the screen, like a question lingering in the air, like a wake-up call that made the audience pause, questioning themselves and those around. Is them a call to comment and share so that tear would not just change one Sunrise Cafe, but become the spark that lights up countless other Sunrise Cafes, places where fairness only needs one small act to return. Fairness does not lie in cold revenue reports or dry numbers on a pause screen. It lies in the way you as a founder, manager, or anyone in a second home like Sunrise Cafe choose to treat the people who have given their youth, sweat, and tears to build this place. Because just one look of understanding, one timely thank you, or one transparent way of dividing tips, those little things, when placed in the right place, can turn a gloomy morning into a day full of hope. And more than that, they can revive the trust of hearts that were once forgotten. Because fairness, after all, does not lie in the monthly financial report. It lies in every tear that has fallen, every tip that has been divided, and in the way each of us chooses to keep our promises to one another, to make this cafe a second home, a place where everyone can smile after each shift, knowing their sweat is valued. Because a single tear can change an entire system.